My name's Miguel Vilar, and I'm a genetic anthropologist and a professor at the University of Maryland. And I'm here to present to you some information around DNA, ancient DNA, and the highlights of ancient connections, which you can encounter and you can work with through FamilyTreeDNA Discover. So what is ancient DNA? It is a fascinating young field within my area of expertise, genetic anthropology, that uses DNA from ancient human remains, isolates it, and analyzes it. And unlike previous generations of DNA studies in anthropology and other fields, we relied on the DNA of living people. Now we can actually use this technology called ancient DNA to look at the DNA from people who are not here anymore. And in some cases, we're talking about decades or centuries ago, but also millennia and tens of thousands of years ago. And this amazing new technology has only been around about 15 years. 2010 or so is when the field took off. And we're seeing a new renaissance in great improvement in ancient DNA in academic as well as in genealogical fields. So back then, even before the 2010s, was the 1990s. And a movie we all are familiar with, a blockbuster called Jurassic Park, gave us a peek into what ancient DNA is. Ancient DNA is a study, and in this case, in the case of Hollywood, the recreation of extinct animals from their DNA left behind. Well, the reality of that field came to be more in the 2000s and early 2010s with people like Svante Pääbo here, who recently won a Nobel Prize for his work on ancient DNA. He's a man pictured there with his head on top of the skull. He and other men around that same age, now in their 50s and 60s, have been leading the field. A man named Eske Willerslev and David Reich are also pictured there. And this amazing new science that allows us to really understand the past by going directly to the past and analyzing the DNA from back then. But I argue that now in the 2020s, we see a change. We see a new revolution in ancient DNA. Now, it's younger people of diverse backgrounds, and lots of women are now involved in this amazing new field. So the science of ancient DNA is a study of the past, and really it requires the technology of a very clean room where any modern DNA doesn't contaminate your scientific work, and it requires often drilling and cleaning and purifying a room so you are dealing only with the DNA, in many cases very fragmentary, left behind by these bones and teeth. And these are pictures right here of what ancient DNA laboratories look like and what the techniques actually employ. But there's challenges around this because ancient DNA is the DNA of individuals that have passed, and it's more of a technology that requires great finesse and great skill. Because even when we get DNA from these ancient remains, it's very fragmentary, very partial. We're getting bits and pieces and small parts. At least we were in the early 2010s, until a new group of scientists started drilling into the petrous bone. And again, drilling into bones sounds almost scary, but that is what we do. We drill into teeth, we drill into bones to get to the well-protected remnants of living DNA in these now past individuals. And thanks to that technology, you see that young woman doing, drilling into the petrous bone, the underneath part of the skull by the temporal ear, inner ear bone, we've been able to get genome coverage a 30x. Much, much sturdier and better for us to understand these ancient genomic sequences. But there's limits. Back in the 2010s, we got maybe 1x coverage or even less. Here's an example of a paper from 2010 looking at Denisova cave. We discovered a new species in Siberia through Sanger sequence, which is traditional sequencing of DNA. Well, fast forward now another 12, 15 years later, we're doing next generation sequencing, which means we're reading hundreds or thousands of markers at a time across in a single species across different markers, and can actually get much higher coverage. And I showed you one earlier that was somewhere in the ballpark of 30 coverage. Now, bringing into the late 2020s, now as we're approaching 2026 into 2027, is there a limit? How far can we go with ancient DNA? We don't know, but the field continues to grow. And some people have argued that we can maybe go not only in longer and more complete segments, but older. We're more accustomed to seeing now sequences DNA sequences from individuals who are 30 or 40,000 years old, like this one here, mentioned in Crimea. But people have argued they've been able to get sequences, at least non-humans, environmental DNA, DNA from ancient sediments that go back millions of years. Here's an example of 2 million-year-old DNA from Arctic life in Greenland. So I put it back to you. The 1990s amazing Hollywood blockbuster, Jurassic Park. Could that really happen? Are we there? Are we able to bring back life from millions of years ago? We definitely are pushing the limits of bringing back life from things 10,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago. There's projects going on right now in ancient DNA to recreate the mammoth and bring back possibly species that have gone extinct in the last decades or centuries. So this is happening. Ancient DNA is no longer science fiction, it's science reality. However, Jurassic Park still remains science fiction. Bringing back the whole woolly mammoth, give science 5 or 10 years, and we may not be that far from seeing a woolly mammoth among us. Now, how does this all tie to ancient DNA? How does it tie to family tree DNA? Well, family tree DNA has a feature through Discover reports that actually you can look at ancient DNA reported from individuals in your haplogroup or in your geographical area and learn more about your own ancestry by looking at these ancient connections. Now, if you're a big Y customer, you have already seen possibly these features through your Discover report. And here's an example of how to get there through your ancient connections. Through the home, you go to Discover, you go to Reports, and you get to this field right here that shows you your haplogroup and how it connects to other groups, and you can see lots of features about your ancient connections. And here, for example, here's a haplogroup common in some parts of South America, and a relative of some ancient samples. We'll see the ancient samples with this archaeological trowel symbol here. And now there's somewhere around 11,000 or more ancient DNA Y chromosomes that you can get through ancient connections. When you buy a big Y and you look for your matches, you can sometimes get hundreds, if not thousands, of matches in your haplogroup. Now, that 11,000 corresponds to all of the ones we have, but that's a very large percentage of the about 15,000 to 20,000 or so ancient human DNAs that exist. So FamilyTreeDNA is certainly a leader in this field, bringing together ancient and modern DNAs. And what can you learn from ancient DNA as a genealogist? Well, you can learn where your haplogroup came from. We have covered every haplogroup really from A to T. We'll tell you how your own lineage matches a sample that maybe is 2,000 years old, 5,000 years old, where that individual lived, the age of death, the archaeological site, the region, the country, the time period. It'll give you some cultural context, and it'll specifically put your lineage at a place at a specific moment in time. And that is unique to ancient DNA. Before, we could actually look at a DNA of living people and try to reconstruct what the ancestor is. Now we can actually go to that haplogroup at a moment in time in the past and tell you specifically where that lineage was, when, and what mutations you share with that individual. And we have more than 10,000 or so available for you to match through ancient connections. What's special about it, I mentioned earlier, ancient DNA anchors a certain haplogroup, Y chromosome, and soon to be seen too, mitochondrial DNA to a specific place in a specific time. Here's a case of an ancient DNA sample from Ireland. You'll figure out what lineage it is, when it lived there, and specifically where. And that is more information than we've ever had before. Thanks for us and our team bringing together ancient and modern DNA. And I find it special that when we look at ancient DNA in the big context, like say across entire Europe, we can see huge historical patterns change. So if you're familiar with the Y chromosome history, the Y chromosome tree, we know that some haplogroups are arising in Europe, others arose in Asia and in Africa. But when you juggle through, when you move through the ancient DNA time frame, you can see the change of haplogroups in the map of Europe, and in a sense trace the ancestry across time and space. For instance, here haplogroup C, E, and F predominate in Europe at a different moment, whereas that's the Paleolithic, with E being more of a North Africa and Middle Eastern, C and F showing up in Europe. But then something happens during the Neolithic in the last 10,000 years or so where haplogroup G, H, and I show up for the first time, J a little bit later. So you can see a change in demographic, a new group of people possibly bringing in agriculture to Europe came in, and so did their haplogroups. And a major phenomenon happens in the Bronze Age where haplogroup R, the most common one in Europe, shows up in large numbers about 2000 BC. So by moving through the time frame and looking at the changes in haplogroups, we are reconstructing major migratory events that happen in the continent of Europe. And this is thanks to some major things we've discovered. For instance, we were able to say so much from Ötzi the Iceman. We not only know his Y chromosome, we know exactly when he lived. We get some high details about his mutations, but we even know more about him, like how he lived. Um, what was this? What's the cultural association with him? We even know a little bit more about his skin. We know some about what he wore. We know a little bit about the context of his stomach. So not just ancient DNA, but other types of ancient studies have really brought an individual back to life. And I love this quote by Ernest Hemingway. Every man has two deaths, when he is buried in the ground and the last time somebody says his name. Ötzi is with us now for the eternity of ancient DNA. This man is now living his second life and no longer has had a second death, thanks to ancient DNA. There's other famous ancient connections that you can make through Discover. Cheddar Man from England, who lived about 7,000 BC. Hunters and gatherers from Sweden, who lived about 6,000 BC. Do you match these? Does your haplogroup match these? Or a Paleo-American man, the Kennewick Man, or the ancient one, as it's called by some people in this country, who lived in Kennewick, Washington, around 7,000 BC. So what does this all look like in your own Discover report? Well, here's haplogroup R, for instance. Globetrekker allows you to trace through history and time the SNPs and the changes in your lineage thanks to ancient DNA. And here, the time tree, another option on your Discover report, you can click and see where your haplogroup falls, what countries is today, and also look along the branches to see if there's any ancient relatives of yours as well. And again, the ancient connection gives you a summary of that haplogroup, when it lived, and how closely you are related to that ancient individual. Look at mine, for instance. I am haplogroup R. My ancestors trace back to northern Spain, and sure enough, Globetrekker puts my lineage right here, and my shared ancestor goes back to the Bronze Age with this individual from northern Spain. So, thanks to ancient DNA, I've been able to sort of pinpoint my ancient Y chromosome haplogroup to that part of Iberia. A couple more things about ancient DNA that get me excited. The conversation is no longer about how quickly we can do, how much we can learn. It's also about how to do it ethically. Because it is destructive. I showed you how we drill into bones and teeth to get the DNA. Well, we need to sort of stop and think about this because we are scientists taking care of these human remains. We are archaeologists. We are curators, in a sense, ourselves. So the question now has moved, how can we do this in collaboration and ethically? In the last few years, scientists have been involved in the better understanding the ethics around ancient DNA. Also, equity. It should not be dominated by one lab or many labs, and it should be science for us to share. So thanks to that policy, you can actually match your DNA to thousands of others through the policy that all ancient DNA belongs to everybody. However, I'm involved in groups going to Mexico and Kenya and trying to empower archaeologists, empower local communities to take their own history in their hands thanks to this technology. And I'm excited to see where this goes for now. So how can you, as a genetic genealogist, learn more about it? There's plenty of books right here. David Reich, I mentioned earlier. Jennifer Raff has written some. Here's Elizabeth Jones, The Celebrity Science of Ancient DNA. You don't necessarily have to go find bones. We actually say no, and it's not your job to find bones. It is your job to go to Discover, see how well you matches as the scientists lead the field. And this, again, is a perfect marriage, I think, of genealogy and academia. So here's a couple more examples. There's 300 so cases in FamilyTreeDNA alone where we see somebody's closest connection, closest genealogical connection is an ancient sample. Here's an example for haplogroup E, R, here's haplogroup Q, where you may not have found a relative, but you may find a specific ancient sample from a place and time that helps you pinpoint your ancestry in a very specific way. I find it interesting when we can actually make sense about the moments when certain lineages moved across Europe. Here's haplogroup R L21. We know as one probably a patriarch of England, or so say. We don't necessarily find it anywhere in continental Europe. However, we find it associated with Belgica culture, which lived in Europe around that late middle of Bronze Age. Now we see it actually in that time frame between 2500 and 2300. We see a few of samples showing up in southern England, and a few hundred years later, we see that same haplogroup show up all the way up to Scotland and Ireland as well. Thanks to being able to toggle through the time frame, you can see this haplogroup spread across a few hundred years in Great Britain. So ancient DNA, now that we have tens of thousands, over 10,000, we can actually use this to look at the step-by-step migration of people across the continent. Here's another example where we can see haplogroup E, one that pinpoints you in North Africa until about 2000, maybe 2500 years ago, when we see it show up in Spain and later in Italy. Right around the time that we learned that Carthage and Hannibal led an army of elephants into Rome and battled the big Carthaginian War versus Rome, right around the time where this haplogroup spread north from North Africa into Southern Europe. So are we seeing history, ancient history, through DNA? Quite possibly. And it makes me quite excited to understand this. Haplogroup E, for example, we see it in the Neolithic. We see some cases show up here in pockets. This is a different part of E. And then it spreads as a Mediterranean lineage until modern times. Since the Middle Ages, it spreads throughout Europe. So again, we can see history happen right in front of our eyes. So explore discover features, explore ancient connections, and help us help you understand your past better. Because we bring together ancient DNA and modern DNA, and of course, your DNA. Thank you very much.